Welcome to richplanet.net, the program which aims to uncover the truth behind the alien and UFO mystery. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's program is about UFOs. Most television programs about UFOs concentrate on sightings, which is very interesting. What is far more interesting is the UFOs themselves. In other words, how they work. In this program, I will briefly touch on some UFO sightings, but will be mainly concerned with UFO functionality. Let's start by looking briefly at some of the best photographs available. And when I say best photographs, I mean that the photographs are bona fide, genuine items. The background of the person who took each picture has been investigated, as have the pictures themselves, and there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that these pictures are fake. Clearly, when people say there is no evidence of UFOs, it is simply because they haven't looked. Let's move on to the interesting part. How do UFOs work? There are a few people in the past who have come forward with inside knowledge through their involvement with the US Black Ops programs. One of these people is Bob Lazar. In 1988 and 1989, Lazar worked for the US Navy at a secret base called S4. Lazar is a physicist and propulsion expert. His role in the program was to try and work out or back-engineer the propulsion system of a flying saucer that the US government had acquired from aliens. Other scientists, such as Tom Vallone, have also given information on how UFO craft operate. I will describe some of his claims later. Some people have tried to debunk Bob Lazar, claiming that he was planted by the government, or that he made the whole thing up to make money, or that he did not have academic qualifications. To answer these claims, I will point out a few facts about Bob Lazar. Firstly, having watched his videos in which he explains the craft's propulsion system, there is no doubt in my mind that he is educated to a high level in physics. Secondly, the claims about him making up the story. He has passed polygraphic lie detector tests, and the police officer who undertook the tests stated, "If he's lying, he ought to be in Hollywood." Also, his story has not changed at all since he went public in 1989. Lazar has not really profited from this story and has moved on to work in other fields. Thirdly, in 2006, Lazar was arrested and had his house raided by the US government because he had built a particle accelerator in his back garden in order to carry out research into hydrogen-propelled vehicles. If he was planted by the government in 1989, why would he be arrested in 2006? He is clearly not on their side. And fourth, in fairly recent years, Lazar has given lengthy interviews about work he was involved with in the 1980s. And by analysing his language and phraseology 20 years later, it is clear he was telling the truth. After he describes the propulsion system of the craft, he goes on to say, "The navigation and flight control side of things still puzzle me." He is genuinely still puzzled about aspects of the UFO he worked on in 1989. Without further ado, let's explain the propulsion system of the UFO proposed by Bob Lazar. It's a fairly well accepted view that at least some UFOs use a gravity or anti-gravity propulsion system, and the Lazar UFO is no exception. In order to explain anti-gravity, I'm first going to explain a little bit about conventional aircraft. First of all, what is flying? Well, rather than consider flying, let's just consider getting off the ground, because the two are not the same. There are three different ways that we Earthlings have discovered that will get us off the ground and into the sky. The first method is the hot air balloon. This method relies on the fact that the air around us is a fluid which has mass. If we create an object which is on average less dense or lighter than the air surrounding it, then it will float above the surrounding air. The hot air balloon is essentially floating on the air in the same way that a plastic duck floats in the bath. This method of getting us off the ground is not really flying, but floating. The second method is what we would consider flying. The Wright brothers achieved the first flight in 1903, and the difference between this and a balloon is that the plane is heavier than the air, whereas the balloon is not. Hence, the Wright brothers' aeroplane was not floating, but flying. Flight is achieved by the craft creating pressure underneath the wings due to the airflow above and below the wings causing lift. This is also true of a helicopter. When a bird flaps its wings, it creates the same effect. This is what we humans call flying. The third method that Earthlings have discovered is used by a space rocket or indeed by a firework. The upward thrust uses Newton's third law. By creating a force in a downward direction, an equal and opposite thrust is created in an upward direction, propelling the rocket. In this type of motion, we would not consider the craft to be flying. The first two methods discussed here would not work on the moon or on any planet that has no atmosphere. They rely totally on there being surrounding air to work. The third method would work without air, but requires lots of heavy fuel to eject out the back of the craft in order to project it off the ground. Of the methods mankind has discovered, two don't work in space and the third requires lots of heavy fuel. Having considered these three methods, you now need to forget them. The UFO doesn't get off the ground using any of these techniques, and it certainly doesn't fly, float, or use thrust, but it does get off the ground, and I will explain how. We need to consider why things stay on the ground in the first place. We've all heard of gravity. In everyday physics, we know that a very large object, such as the Earth, attracts all other objects and causes them to accelerate towards it. We observe this when an apple falls from a tree. This pulling force is dependent on the weight or mass of the large object. All objects on Earth are actually attracted to each other by the same gravity, but the size of the force is so small you don't notice the attraction between objects, only towards the Earth. It's only when something becomes as large as the Earth that there is a significant pull. We should now consider why a large mass pulls all other masses towards it. To best describe the effect of gravity, it's easier to consider the universe as being two-dimensional. In other words, there is no up or down. The universe is just a flat surface. Consider placing the Earth in this two-dimensional universe. It bends the space around it. This bending of space is what a gravitational field is, except it works in 3 dimensions, which is impossible to picture in our mind, so we will continue to use 2 dimensions in this example. We can now place an apple in our universe, and as expected, it falls to the Earth. Let's put the apple back. Now consider for a moment how we could prevent the apple from falling to the Earth. Well, what if we created another distortion away from the Earth, just behind the apple, like so? The apple could then balance on the rim and would essentially just stay in mid-air. And this is how the UFO stays off the ground. It generates its own gravity well away from the Earth's, such that the two are cancelling out the effect of each other. This is why, when the UFOs hover, their motion is seen to be slightly unstable, because the propulsion system has to make constant corrections to keep the two balanced, a bit like balancing on a tightrope. Note that anyone inside a craft hovering in this fashion would be weightless, so the craft stays off the ground using a method unlike any conventional aircraft. It is in effect interfering with the thing that keeps us on the ground in the first place, gravity. Imagine then if we allow the apple to start to fall into the gravity well that it has created, but as it falls, then move the position of the well further from the earth. We could then make the apple move at incredible speed, and this is how the propulsion is achieved in an anti-gravity craft. So how on earth can these craft manipulate space in this way? How do they produce their own gravity? Well, according to Bob Lazar's explanation, the craft use a special chemical element called ununpentium, or element 115, which is found at the very end of our periodic table. A small piece of the element is used at the heart of a gravity reactor. In this reactor, the element is bombarded with protons and very briefly is turned into element 116. This element does not exist for long, but when it does, emits a gravity wave, which is then focused using 3 gravity amplifiers housed in the belly of the flying saucer, which then produces the gravity wave, causing the distortion of space to propel the craft. The reactor also produces massive quantities of energy in an antimatter type nuclear reaction that is required to achieve the distortion of space. The UFO craft proposed by Bob Lazar uses a reactor with element 115 as its fuel to produce a gravity wave. When the craft travels long interstellar distances, it has a mode known as delta configuration. When the flying saucer travels in this mode, using 3 gravity amplifiers focused at a point in space, it travels at 90 degrees to the plane of the disk, not as you would see it in a science fiction film traveling sideways. This type of movement has been confirmed in many UFO sightings, when the craft are seen to hover almost stationary, as I described earlier, then they shoot off vertically in the blink of the eye at impossible speed. This happened in 2006 in a very famous sighting at O'Hare International Airport. The UFO cut a perfect circle in the clouds as it departed vertically upwards. So if all this is true, how come we are not flying around in these flying saucers? Well, one reason is because element 115 does not occur naturally on Earth and has been brought here by aliens from other parts of our galaxy, so the magic fuel is not readily available. We have touched briefly on the propulsion system, but what about the flight control and navigation? As I mentioned earlier, Lazar stated a few years ago that these things still puzzled him. He claimed that there was a distinct lack of instrumentation within the craft. Other people who have witnessed the recovered Roswell UFO, such as Werner von Braun, are known to have said that the controls were in some respect biological, that the craft was connected to the alien's brain directly, and that flying the craft was more like playing the piano or playing a game of chess. If you're sitting thinking that all this is science fiction and that faster than light travel is science fiction, then think again. In 1996, theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre produced a remarkable paper which grew from his work in general relativity, which is the current standard model for space-time and gravitation. His paper describes a very unusual solution to Einstein's equations of general relativity, described in the title as a warp drive and in the abstract as a modification of space-time in a way that allows a spaceship to travel at an arbitrarily large speed. Alcubierre described in detail, along with all of the required mathematics, an explanation of how faster than light travel can be achieved. The proposal is very similar to the simplified explanation I gave earlier, but the principles are the same. The diagram here depicts Alcubierre's mathematical model, showing the distortion of space both in front and behind of the region of space in the middle, which travels faster than light. To put this simply, without going into all of the equations, the normal rules for the maximum possible speed of travel do not occur when you start bending space itself. the alien craft may not use the exact method proposed by Michael Ackelbier, but his work certainly lays to rest all of the claims from diehards who think that faster-than-light travel is not possible. Another point to note about the craft described by Bob Lazar is that the craft has no sharp edges. He describes that there are no sharp edges anywhere. Even where the ceiling meets the floor, everything has a curve to it, as if it was all fashioned out of wax. The reason that the craft's shape is so curved and smooth, both internally and externally, is because a byproduct of the propulsion system is a very large electric field. Now, when you have a strong electric field, it is important to prevent electric discharge. This is effectively what lightning is. And by having smooth edges serves to prevent the discharge. Another effect of strong electric fields is that air molecules become excited and start to emit photons of light. So the air around a UFO craft usually glows. It's very common in UFO sightings for people to see coloured lights or extremely bright balls of light. And this is because they are not actually seeing the craft. What they are seeing is the air around the craft glowing because of the electric field. Thomas Vallone is a leading scientist in energy and electromagnetics and claims that the US Black Ops government have craft which use inertial shielding. This is a shield around the vehicle to stop the inertial mass from having any sizable impact whatsoever. This means that the craft can accelerate at phenomenal speed because their own mass effectively is tiny. He believes that inertial shielding was back-engineered from UFO craft. In earlier years, Tom Vallone worked on a device called a homopolar generator. Basically, it is a metal disc which has a circular magnet attached to it and a metal shaft connected to the center of the disc. When the shaft is connected to a motor and spun, a voltage is generated between the edge of the metal disc and the shaft. These generators produce a low DC voltage, but a high current in the range of 10,000 amperes. He believes that the homopolar machine uses a similar effect to the propulsion system of some UFOs. An oval-shaped UFO, which is believed to have been witnessed hovering above Giant Rock in California, had two rotating discs. The size of the ship was about 50 to 100 feet in diameter. The discs were rotating in opposite directions, one of them producing electricity. There were 12 magnets around the edge. He believes that the two discs together produced an anti-gravity effect. There was also plasma which extended down from the craft. From what we have learned so far about UFOs, I can summarize some of the common characteristics one might observe. 1. They are uniform or smooth in shape. 2. The craft emit intense light, sometimes different colors. 3. The craft give off a strong electric field. And 4. The craft can produce a speed and an acceleration far higher than any known aircraft. In order to back this up, let's hear from somebody who actually saw and touched a UFO in England in 1980. My name is James Peniston, United States Air Force retired. In 1980, I was assigned to the largest tactical fighter wing in the Air Force at the time. I was stationed at RAF Woodbridge in England. I was the senior security officer in charge of that base security. At the time, I held a top-secret US and NATO security clearance and was responsible for the protection of the war-making resources at that base. Shortly after midnight, on the 26th of December 1980, Staff Sergeant Steffens briefed me that some lights were seen in Rendlesham Forest, just outside the back gate. He informed me that whatever he had seen didn't crash. He told me it landed. I discounted that and reported to the control centre that we had a possible downed aircraft. I then ordered Airman Kabanzak and A1C Burrells to respond with me off-site. When we arrived to the suspected crash site, it quickly became apparent that we were not dealing with a plane crash, or for that matter, anything else we've ever responded to. There was a bright light emanating from an object on the forest floor. As we approached it on foot, a silhouetted triangular craft, about 9 feet long, and 6.5 feet high came into view. The craft was fully intact and sitting in a small clearance just inside the woods. As the three of us got closer to the craft, we started experiencing radio difficulties. I then asked Airman Kabanzak to relay the radio transmission back to our control centre to act as a relay. Burrows and I proceeded towards the craft. When we came up on the triangular craft, there were blue and yellow lights swirling around the exterior as though they were part of the surface. The air around us was electrically charged, and we could feel it on our clothes, our skin and our hair. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I was witnessing. After about 10 minutes without any apparent aggression, I determined that the craft was not hostile to my team and to the base. Following the security protocols, we completed a thorough on-site investigation. This included a full physical examination of the craft, which included photographs and my notebook entries that I had at the time, and the relays with the radio through Airman Kabanzak to our control centre. Those were acquired. On one side of the craft there were symbols that measured 3 inches high, and they were approximately 2.5 feet long. The feeling I had during the encounter was like no type of aircraft that I've ever seen before. It was not in the Jane's Book of Known Aircraft or anything I've seen since. After roughly about 45 minutes, the light of the craft began to intensify. Burrows and I then took a defensive position away from the craft as it lifted off the ground without any noise or air disturbance. It maneuvered through the trees and shot off at an unbelievable rate of speed. It was gone in the blink of an eye. In my logbook that I have right here, I wrote, "Speed, impossible." That night, over 80 Air Force personnel, all trained observers assigned to the 81st Security Police Squadron, witnessed the takeoff. The information acquired during that investigation was reported to my military channels. The team and witnesses were told to treat the investigation as top secret and no further discussion would be allowed. The photographs that we retrieved from the base, 2 rolls of 35mm, were of course, apparently overexposed. Jim Peniston's testimony provides compelling evidence that a UFO landed on British soil. I recently read some letters that the MOD sent in response to Ralph Noy's requests for information about the Rendlesham case. The letters are nothing short of pathetic and show that the MOD know more than they let on. Here are a few extracts from the MOD's letters. I can assure you that no unidentified object was seen on any radar recordings during the period in question, and that the MOD has no knowledge of the tape recording or cinefilm you mention. As we have said in the past, the report sent by Colonel Holt was examined by those in the department responsible for the air defence of the UK, and since then there has been nothing to alter the view that there was no defence significance to the incident. Speaking personally, I can accept that people do from time to time see things in the sky which they find difficult to explain. I am sure you will agree that in many cases normal explanations come to light, such as falling meteors, satellite debris, or unusual cloud formations. When will our government come clean and admit what they know about UFOs? By keeping it secret, they must think we were all born yesterday.